Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Filippo Cattapan, and I'm glad to welcome you to this third and last TACK talk, last at least for this second series. As you know, the TACK talks are an initiative of the EU-funded TACK Research Network, which is a community of universities, but also of offices, and of cultural institutions, which are now investigating together the notion of tacit knowledge within the field of architecture. In the second series, we wanted to start in a way a dialogue with the three cultural institutions which are part of the network. So with the Architecture Centrum Wien, with the Flanders Architecture Institute of Antwerp, and with the new Architecture Institute of Rotterdam. We decided to do that, inviting each time two of the cultural institutions, and proposing a series of questions which we thought could have been relevant in order to start this dialogue with them on both their activities and on their overall horizons. The question we addressed them for tonight is how to define what belongs where, which is mainly centered on the context in which these institutions are active, context in the wide sense, whether local, national, or international context, and on the specific ways in which these cultural institutions differently engage with such context. To discuss this topic, we have here tonight three guests. Julia Ertas, who is coordinator of exhibitions and publications at the Flanders Architecture Institute. And then we have Marten Kuipers and Ludo Grön, both architects and researchers based in Rotterdam at the new institute. After their two presentations, we will have a bit of time for a conversation with them, which will be mainly guided by two researchers of the TACK network, two colleagues of mine, Kaendia Weinbelt, who is a PhD fellow at the Leibniz Universität Hannover, and John Bennett, who is fellow at the Bartlett School of Architecture in London. It will be possible to pose questions also on the chat for our audience from both the two platforms on which we are broadcasted at the moment. If you all agree, I think we could start directly, and I would give the floor first to Julia.
Hello, everyone. I assume that you can see my screen. Okay. Thank you a lot, Filippo, for the invitation and also the whole organization of the talk. Even just preparing this discussion together with you and Martin and Ludo from the new institute was already very inspiring. Today I will talk about a specific project that we did in Flanders Architecture Institute. It's the project of the architect Leon Steinen that we did during the years of 2017 and 19. It is important before starting to say that I wasn't working at the Flanders Architecture Institute at that time, so I gathered all the information from my colleagues. So I would also like to thank everyone who worked on this project, and especially Dirk Loris, who also helped me a lot in preparing this presentation. So who is Leon Steinen? He's actually he born almost at the beginning of the 20th century and lived until 1990. He's an Antwerp-based architect, and most of his work is also in Antwerp, but also all over Belgium. Has over 400 designs over the 50 years of his active years. He also had an important role in the transformation of the architectural education and is also a cultural figure important to understand the modern architecture in Belgium, especially in the interbellum period. So I have organized this talk in a kind of like a circular wave of contexts, because Leon Steinen is also the architect who designed the buildings that the offices of Flanders Architecture Institute are in. So this image is actually one of our daily work environment image of his work. And this is a school designed by Steinen in Brussels, which I didn't know that it was his work, but I had declared it already as my favorite building in Brussels. Then while researching Steinen, I learned that it is his building. So actually, it's a very daily encounter and the familiarity that we have with Steinen's work. Another context, a bit maybe on a national and organizational level, while working on the project of the Leon Steinen, actually the architectural archives of the province of Antwerp and the Center of Flanders Architectural Archives came together under the merger of the Flanders Architecture Institute's archives. So it is at the same time the 30th year of the starting of the province of Antwerp's archives. So it's the whole program is based on this idea of celebrating the archives and at the same time making it visible and accessible to a wider public. These are the parts of the program in a how I would say, in a like a tech cloud way. The oral history, visual documentation, and digitization of the archive are actually the parts that allow for the further parts of the program to happen. It's a research in itself, but it's also an investigation, like an investment for the future research. And then we have in this part with the exhibition, architecture tours, heritage days, the special issue of the Openbaar Kunst Bezit. We see there more localized, like Antwerp-based parts of the program, while the book, the Wiki project, and the International Congress are, how I would say, more spaceless parts of the program because they can be anywhere. And then there are parts that are localized but extend the very local context of Antwerp and Steinen's designs to a broader audience. So the digitization of the archive, 4,000 drawings and photos from the archives of the Steinen and De Meyer were digitized during this process. And there was an oral history study with the family, clients, residents, employees, and students of Steinen. And we also did a visual documentation on the contemporary state of his works by a well-known Belgian architectural photographer, Philippe Dujardin. I'm going to start with like this circular waves. I'm going to start the bits that happened more in the Antwerp and then go further. So this is this is an image from the exhibition space of Steinen. As I said, the digitization contemporary photography and also the oral history were embedded into this exhibition. But as you can see, it's more like a two-dimensional and mostly towards a public that is more interested or knowledgeable already in the architecture preservation and so on. So it's in a way, I will repeat myself, but to celebrate that we have these archives and we are making it accessible to a broader public. And a part of the program in the exhibition was Stenen on Scale. It's a participatory project with Eagles of Architecture, an architecture office in Belgium, the Wehrmann, participatory art NGO, and technical schools. So they worked together to understand and reinterpret the facades of the projects of Stenen. This is an image in Antwerp from the installation. Another thing, because one of the main decisions that were taken on the Stenen project was to create these various collaborations with various institutions, and because you already have a list of projects, you have an architect, you have his biography, etc. But then how do you communicate to different audience groups? And in this case, different institutions and organizations were key. And for the Heritage Days, we collaborated with the city of Antwerp to make this architecture route, and it can be on bike or on foot. And then there's the Wikilove's Heritage Project, which is actually a photo contest to add new photos of Stenen's designs to Wikimedia. Another component was the International Congress, Architecture and Professionalism. It's to draw dialogues between the postmodern architectures across Europe. So we had scholarly contributions from Italy, Austria, and some other countries. It was more like trying to understand Stenen in his own contemporary works. And then there's the book. Now we are kind of getting into more spaceless context, but a wider one. And this is after the after an exhibition on Stenen in 1990. This is actually the most comprehensive look into Stenen's works. So the whole book is a comprehensive biography with the photographs, and it has different perspectives in 9 essays. When you flip through the book, you get an understanding, a very detailed understanding of Stenen and his whole work. Young Promising Architects, this is actually one of the joint projects we do together with the New Institute. It's a visiting program, so architects from Netherlands and Flanders did building visits and workshops together in this bit. And now we are kind of this entire contextual level. We are jumping to London. The archive and parts of the exhibition in the single was taken to London Festival of Architecture in 2019. And so it is actually taking Stenen into this international audience and also recontextualizing his work in another brutalist design, the Silver Building in London. And also the Stenen on Scale installation went there this time and find itself a new space under the highway. That's it. Thank you. I hope to discuss more in the questions, maybe.
Thank you very much, Julia, for presenting this project, which I think actually responded very well also to our main question, but also raises obviously many others and many possible reflections. I think we could leave all them for later and go directly and give directly the word to Martin and Ludo for their presentation. So Martin, Ludo, when you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Filippo. Thanks for the invitation. Pleasure to be here. Yeah, let's start. Our presentation expands on the project Automated Landscapes, which is or was a long-term collaborative research initiative into, let's say, the implications of automation in the built environment. Launched in 2017 by the research department of a new institute, which is headed by Marino Theo Vergier. Next slide, yes. Well, basically the project started here, which may sound a bit strange, but this is the state, or actually it's not the state archive for Dutch architecture and urban planning. It's a representation of this archive that we manage in the institute. It contains roughly 1.4 million drawings, more than 300,000 photographs, 2,500 models, 50,000 books and magazines, well, a lot, and together aiming to document the history of Dutch architecture and urbanism. Next slide. As keeper of this archive, het New Institute has the responsibility to preserve and collect not only the past, but also the current architectural production for future generations.
Let's have a closer look at that archive. It is based on the oeuvres of select architects, of which, in fact, 97% are men, ordered by project and with a particular focus on so-called experimental architectures. A few years ago, the Institute basically decided to also incorporate other narratives and forms of architecture that are not necessarily connected to the idea of authorship or iconic buildings, but yet played a rather important role in the transformation of society. What you're looking at here is an example of the research and exhibition project, Architecture of Appropriation, which was documenting 6 squatted locations through making use of architectural drawings, interviews, and archival material, which were all drawn up together with the residents. So what started as a research project in this context into squatting as a spatial practice eventually ended up as an acquisition to the archive, cataloged following the archive's ordering system.
Now it's my turn again. Similarly, we got interested in these spaces, which you can see here, situated right next to us in our own backyards, say Rotterdam's backyard. This is for you the latest extension to the port of Rotterdam, which is called Maasvlakte 2 or 2. Yet we hardly know these spaces, these environments, and we rarely have access to them either. So from automated dairy farms, greenhouses, and data centers to this automated container terminal in the harbor of Rotterdam. Even though these structures would actually never appear on the covers of architecture magazines, we noticed how these architecture not only disrupted labor markets, but the configuration, design, and occupation of entire territories. Driven by efficiency, corporate interest, and governmental policies, horticultural farmers oversee ever-growing automated operations through dashboards on desktop computers and smartphone apps. Soil, plants, and workers become data. We noticed recurring patterns among both agricultural and server farms, between their regimes, protocols, processes, but also between their structural and financial constructions.
Rather than considering the periphery as the forefront of change, like others did, we were actually more interested in documenting the mutual interdependencies between, let's say, the city and its hinterland, and considering also then within that the responsibilities that architects have to respond to these disruptive technological advancements. Oh. So what we started to do is to document these landscapes in the same objects that make up the State Archive, from drawings to photographs, ultimately aiming to include these into the archive as well. So at the same time, actually we were interested also in understanding architecture, not only from a human-centered perspective, but instead spaces like these are optimized for non-humans, in this particular case, robots and orchids.
We started with a fascination for fully automated workspaces. And for instance, you know, the notion of the lights out factory, that factory where you can just switch off the light because, you know, there is no human being in there anymore. That's why we started with the container terminal, which was promoted as a fully automated container terminal. But then we gradually noticed how the operations in these environments are still very much dependent and contingent on human bodies. So the delicate labor of picking fruits and cutting leaves in greenhouses, for example, is still a manual task operated by seasonal labor and assisted by automated Gaia vehicles and other robots. In data centers too, none of the operations turned out to be exclusively automatic. Engineers in this data center arrive at the neighboring airport and enter any time of the day. They can work according to their own local time zone, install and maintain hardware, and leave again. Day and night no longer exists here. Also, the farmer has to adapt to the 24/7 uptime rhythm of his robotic co-workers. Manure on a sensor urges him or her to take immediate action, even in the middle of the night. The changing relationship between worker and machine led to a condition in which the worker, that was once in control of machines, is no longer at the center of the production process. While in dominant narratives, automation seems synonymous with a future of work without workers, we encountered new modes of cohabitation of humans and machines which are continuously reconfigured and redesigned. Even if these result in vast architectural and territorial transformations, their designs are often unnoticed by the discourse of architecture. Critically analyzing these environments is only a first step for exploring and enabling possible and desirable futures where humans and non-human bodies can engage in non-exploitative forms of cohabitation.
So how do we perform this type of research? So aside from public events to disseminate and reflect upon our findings, we organized these kind of tours to data centers, to automated dairy farms, to factories in both the Netherlands and the Pearl River Delta, for which we invited both students, architects, scientists, researchers, and also others to help us with these documentations. Moreover, the project was a very largely collaborative effort. So for each of the building typologies we studied over the past 4 or 5 years, we collaborated with different local partners. So for the research on factories, for example, in the Pearl River Delta, we collaborated with Merve Bedir from the Shenzhen-based Forma Academy. For the research on dairy farms and greenhouses with Victor Muniz from the TU Delft. And for the data centers research with Ippolito Pastellini and Camille Dakir from OMA and the Royal College of Art. So this brings us to already the conclusion of our short presentation, in which I would like to reflect a bit about the question you raised in this event and, let's say, relating these institutions to its geographical context, for example, through its acquisition policies for its collection. So when a new institute founded its research department in 2015, it was kind of positioned at the core of its institutional program. So also to reflect on its own institutional practices. So the promise was basically that research was not necessarily connected to specific outputs, such as exhibitions or publications, as often seen in cultural institutions. But in the case of automated landscapes, what started here, I think, and that's maybe to end with, is that what started as an urge to document an unknown territory ended up with us questioning what of the contemporary architectural production needs to be archived for the future. And ultimately, in that sense, questioning ourselves, as in the reason of our existence being the state archive. So thank you, and I'm curious to continue the conversation with some of your questions.
Thank you, Ludo. Thank you very much to all of you for your presentations. Perhaps just one brief comment before to open the discussion also with Kaendia and Jono. I think first of all that it was very meaningful to see your beautiful projects together tonight. Before the presentations, I have to say I had more clear which were the differences between the two, but actually now after, I think they also share some crucial affinities in the end, because they, on one side, they both produce a knowledge that is primarily grounded on their close geographical context, let's say, one more historically and more traditionally, and one more technically. And on the other, because they both try to communicate this sort of local knowledge also at a wider sort of level. And this means obviously also a shifting sorry, perhaps Ludo, if you are perfect, just for us to see each other. And yes, I was saying, and this means also a continuous shifting between different kinds of communities. Some of them more related to the discipline, some others more open, more generic, and obviously with very different kinds of interest in relation to the contents and to the knowledge which was produced by these projects. This is obviously, again, producing a very specific kind of impact, I think, and of cultural awareness on the communities which are addressed and involved. And perhaps this is a very different kind of impact compared to the usual one produced by the established, let's say, traditional ways of exhibiting architecture. Just to say that for all these reasons, I think that a reflection on these two projects could be very meaningful as a starting point from which to look at the production of architectural culture or architectural knowledge, but also on the impact of this culture on its multiple and varied communities. But yeah, I will stop here and I will open immediately the discussion. So Kaendia and Jono, please join the conversation as you prefer.
Thank you so much for the presentations. It was actually really nice to visit them beforehand with certain expectations and then see them live and always discovering new parts and new aspects. I was wondering if maybe we could start off with a question on, well, the context of these projects. And I was kind of wondering, do you think that these projects could have been investigated and approached in the same way if they were in a different context or place. So if they were documenting events or people outside of your specific local context. And in other words, did locality matter here in these two projects? And if it mattered, perhaps both of your, how did it matter? And both of your institutions open to a broader context in the exhibits and in the archival approaches that you have. But it's maybe interesting to look at the context of these two projects and the specific fact that they were based in Antwerp and Rotterdam and focused on these areas, but also reaching out to other places. So yeah, I would be curious about that.
Maybe to start, I think one thing we really learned also from this project was, let's say, the kind of dichotomy between, let's say, locality and global is very problematic to start with. So I think that's maybe already also giving a little bit of an answer to this question, because obviously it wouldn't have been possible to kind of study this phenomena without kind of having that in our backyard. With a different backyard, the starting point would have been different. But at the same time, of course, because of its kind of interdependency with that global scale, perhaps we would have ended with similar conclusions, right? Because these phenomena are kind of omnipresent also. And that's why maybe the second part of the answer would be that while we started in the Netherlands, at some moments we really also felt that urge to kind of expand towards the Pearl River Delta, to also kind of almost test our hypotheses in different territories, but also to perhaps even have a kind of glimpse on the future in that context, in which obviously some phenomena are more kind of harshly experienced, or inequalities are more harsh coming to the surface. So I think in that sense there is always that kind of locality versus global, which is at stake. Yeah.
Great. I'll take the opportunity while there's a void of silence in my house to ask a question. And I'll actually pick up on that question of the locality. So for me, I was really intrigued that when you started to look at squatting as a sort of expanded spatial practice, and my limited experience of certain squats in Berlin and in Amsterdam, and the kind of nature of what squatting means in the context of the Netherlands is very different, for example, in the context of South Africa, where there's sort of massive housing shortages and all sorts of complicated politics of land ownership. And for example, Gautam Van from India, from the Indian Institute for Human Settlements, he talks about Southern urbanist practices and different languages, and he also uses squatting, but he sort of frames it in a different way. And it's very interesting how the same word obviously can have such different application. And I think in these sort of slippages of where words don't match, it's good. It's not a bad thing. So I'm just curious if there were any other slippages in your exchange with the Pearl River Delta that perhaps you couldn't go into in the presentation, but even if they're sort of anecdotal, I think these are very valuable kind of moments where words or terms don't translate.
I also had the feeling that Julia wanted to perhaps say something about the previous question by Kaindi, but okay, yeah. Anyway, yeah.
I will reply to that later. I think let's keep going.
So.
Well, I think in the squatting project, it's also, and Martin knows much more about it than me, but there was a bit of a similar moment, I guess, as I just described, in which after starting the research here in this context, it was presented also in Sao Paulo, in the Biennale there, and in which it also kind of, I think that's interesting also about what I described as like the disconnection almost between doing research and producing exhibitions, that by kind of going to Sao Paulo, by presenting it there, it immediately was also the research expanded into that context, right? So the kind of testing of your hypothesis and being, let's say, open and vulnerable and presenting your things there is then a kind of continuation of that research. And by really, so to give you an example, this project, also Architecture of Appropriation, still continues, and now it was dormant maybe for a couple of years, and now it kind of gets into reincarnated again into a different context of a new exhibition and or a new kind of case study which pops up in the city of Rotterdam, which is very urgent and pressing. So I think that's super nice about this kind of almost institutional way of working, in which these projects are disconnected from an direct output, but because of that they're also able to transform and to not always provide answers, but also to predominantly ask questions.
Yeah, and to add to that, what I remember from the very start of the project is that we almost immediately reached out to other research collectives in the world that have been doing research on squats from let's say an architectural or spatial perspective as well. For instance, one in Greece, in Italy, many in Italy, by the way, in Berlin as well, in Denmark, in Copenhagen, and in Brazil, and organized workshops, online workshops and events to, discuss and the findings of our research projects, basically, and also to kind of, compare these different localities. To add to that, and no, I think that's what I wanted to add to Ludo's answer.
And I agree with Ludo on this kind of the dichotomy between the local and the global. I agree. It's not working well in any case. I mean, even because compared to the automated landscape projects that the new institute is working on, the Steinem project is more like a classical way of looking at an architect. But even in that case, he's not the only architect working during this modernist period. So you can always draw some parallels between. There's also like he takes inspiration from Le Corbusier, and then probably he influences someone else somewhere in Europe or other parts of the world. So it's this idea, I don't know. But then there's this other issue of the research itself, and I don't want to say like a form, but the exhibition, maybe we can discuss it as a form, because it's the way the research itself takes shape and becomes communicable to a wider or a different audience. The locality becomes important when, because of the institutional missions and visions and things like that. So for us, for example, we are collecting architects from Brussels and Flanders. And this is the meaning of locality in the sense of the institution. But then, of course, it doesn't mean that we are only exhibiting architects from Flanders and Brussels. then it becomes more global, but also, as I said, it doesn't, there's no right answer to that question. Also, maybe the question, this understanding is a bit obsolete.
It's interesting you mentioned the idea of audience, because I think that's perhaps when we have, like, let's say the ground on one hand, in which our kind of institutions are grounded, and perhaps then the audience on the other. I think that's in our project also interesting that when it was first picked up much more by an international audience, which was interested in the project, and where we also pitched it in Venice and all these places. And then only recently, let's say in the last year and a half or 2 years, in which also in the Dutch context gets much more, these problematics or these issues get much more attention, in which they basically, after maybe they condemned us for a couple of years of not doing anything related to architecture, they finally understood to be rather blunt, is that these things are inherently or inherent to the profession of architecture. And then, so in that sense, I think it's interesting also how these audience can, sometimes you perhaps start with a locality and you end with talking to a global audience and the other way around, right?
Yeah, and another thing that we heavily discussed over the course of the years is in order to kind of, engage in a, well, let's call it a global conversation. For instance, if we take the research on squatting and in which we tapped into a discourse, an existing discourse on these types of spatial appropriation, so to say, it is important to be specific and to add specific how to call it, research to that conversation. So to do research on, for instance, squats in this case, in this particular case, or these automated landscapes in your local context is then important to, well, to add something to that conversation instead of, trying to, yeah, to introduce, let's say, more generic notions and perspectives on these types of questions. And another thing that I want to add is that I also want to disagree with lots of people that think that all these automated landscapes, as we just mentioned and introduced in our short presentations, are let's say, spaces, for instance, in our backyards that are completely, like eaten up by this kind of global system, which we call the operational landscapes, with hardly any local specificities anymore. And I want to follow in that sense, what, for instance, the amazing research, for instance, Alessandra Ponte did on the north of Canada, in which she actually tried to kind of, really land in these spaces and do research about the materiality of these places, because it is not a, let's say, a complete abstract or, let's say, globalized operational landscapes that you land at. For instance, if even these greenhouses and not only the rules and regulations that are at play in these spaces and the regimes and processes that are behind these developments, but also the way how, let's say, a local culture and these new phenomena that are landing in these places, these big conglomerates that are opening their greenhouses or data centers, how they actually, well, how to explain it, but how they come together in these contexts is really interesting and really neat, and well, requires a critical eye, I would say. Yeah, and the only thing to do that is, I think, while, let's say, being there, being able to do these field research, the trips to these spaces, to be there, to be in conversation with the people that are behind the actors in these developments, et cetera, and also be able to, for instance, that was a huge difficulty in the research we did in the Pearl River Delta, and that's why we teamed up with local institutions over there to be able to read, for instance, policy papers and yeah.
Yeah, and I think that brings us very well to this thematic of collaboration, because in this context, in the context of local specificities, this proximity that you can get from perhaps reaching out and gathering information not from one source is perhaps quite interesting. And so perhaps beyond capturing and sharing knowledges, these projects also generate knowledge and generate it through collaboration. How would you see these communal forms of generating knowledge, especially when they reach beyond your specific context? And what role could these knowledges be playing in contextually shaping the projects?
Oh yeah, you want to start?
Yeah, I was thinking it's actually in the case of the Steinem project, the research behind all the parts of the program itself, as you said, has generated the knowledge to be further discussed. I was thinking the space of the museum and the exhibition spaces and everything being this kind of Foucauldian heterotopic spaces, which brings us to this different notion of time, because also at VAE we are trying to, it's one of the underlying goals we want to bring in all the projects, to be at the past, present, and the future at the same time. So while looking at the past, like this post-war architecture of Steinen, we still want to make it relevant to this present time. And also the things that you bring forward, hopefully with a critical eye, should provide some new knowledge pieces for the future research. So it is always this kind of heterotopic notion of time, I would say, that we operate in.
Maybe to continue a bit on that is also that as an institute, we're also currently very much interested in, let's say, other types of knowledge productions also when it comes to, let's say, non-human or more than human knowledge. So how can, let's say, the knowledge embedded in, for example, robots or ecologies can also kind of contribute to the knowledge production of our institute, right? So, and in that sense, I think it's interesting, Martin, what you did in the Venice Pavilion, where you were, right, of 2018 is already, in which you were kind of analyzing these systems or these operation systems in these greenhouses and dairy farms, in which these systems and these the kind of looking at that as a kind of basis of knowledge, and how that in the end, obviously, it's almost like the monastery, right, in which the building becomes literally a translation of that operating management system or the time system of that. So I think in that sense, that was also very much a kind of a type of knowledge that we used in the project, especially in the beginning part, looking at these applications, how they operate the building basically, rather than the other way around.
Yeah, and to add to that, what really helped in the project, and no, both projects actually, so architecture of appropriation and automated landscapes, is the many interviews we did with the people involved in these projects, so squatters, people of the municipalities, and in the case of automated landscape, just to talk to farmers, to developers, property developers, to engineers from data centers, but also what our privilege is, I would say, an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary conversation we have on a weekly basis in the institute itself. So, for instance, automated landscape derived from a couple of other projects that were initiated in the research department, done by our colleagues with a background in media cultures, for instance, on notions like algorithmic culture and machine learning and that kind of stuff. And in conversation, the many conversations we had on these topics, we had this hunch like, and what about, let's say, the spatial implications of these new technologies? So that's how basically these projects tend to start in the institute. And these people stay involved. So my colleague Klaas Kuitenbrouwer stays involved in these conversations, So I also say like this. Well, the ability to be able to introduce multiple perspectives on a particular case is necessary. Yeah.
Thank you. I think to get this sort of insight into the kind of background or the behind the scenes is actually really interesting. I think this question of audience to me is, you mentioned it earlier on, particularly around this idea of collaboration and audience. And when Julio was presenting the work, the exhibition work, the workshops that you guys did, or even admitting that your favorite building was this first building, so you know, in a way, you are part of this audience to appreciate this architect. I keep thinking about the kind of tacit way that, you know, we are our audiences, we build our audiences, they are communities of practice often. And I can only imagine as an archivist or a team of different multidisciplinary archivists or working in an archive, you're constantly having to kind of, you know, question this idea of community. And you even mentioned in the beginning that the archive that you currently have, Ludo, is 90 or majority men. So for me, I'm curious about these conversations that happen in your various institutes about, it almost sounds like there's a sort of element of future proofing for future audiences while maintaining your current audience. So you said these conversations are happening, but I'm curious, what are some of the tactics that you guys are speaking about in terms of this future proofing and this future audiencing that's around it?
That's a very hard question because because in the name you have the Flanders Architecture Institute, so automatically I would say the main audience we have are architects, but we are also a public institution, which means we have this mission to reach a broader audience. We are actually now working on the mediation, and while not before coming to the last minute and trying to fine-tune the exhibition, even before at the very start of conceptualizing the exhibitions and different parts of the program, now we are thinking about how we can keep in mind the main target audience and how to reach a broader one. We think we have some ideas. If you put more like three-dimensional objects like models, etc., in the exhibitions, it will be easily understandable by a broader public compared to if you only put plans, like the architectural drawings and so on. But these are, I think, these are very shortcut answers to a very complicated issue that's starting all the way from the, from where you are even exhibiting your content, because the space of the museum itself has its own problematics in the in the recent form. So it's a very and I don't think no one has the magic wand, so everyone's experimenting.
Maybe about our archive, I think, where you refer to, obviously. Yeah, I would say that's now at the moment the core issue in our institute, also after its transformation into a heritage institution since the 1st of January. And I would say, yeah, Martin, you know more about this, but I think what the approach is in our case a bit twofold, in which it's both very much critically reflecting on your collection you already have. So about the kind of, let's say, the cataloging system, the ordering system, the way to kind of really disseminate what is in that archive. But I guess more importantly even is the kind of the holes within it, right? So the fact that it's 97% man. So what are those other, and what are the holes within that history that need to be filled, or maybe also that can be expanded upon? So I think, yeah, Martin, you know.
Yeah, I think what is important here to mention as well, also put it bluntly, to start by saying that, yeah, this future audience that you just referred to, we don't know who this future audience is, right? So, if reflect upon the collection or its acquisition policy, as Ludo just did, I think it's important to acknowledge that this is not something new that we are doing. It's not that, you know, the Institute collected a male architect or the oeuvres of male architects for 100 years. No, it's a collection that is based on an acquisition policy that was changed many times over the course of the years, over the course of those decades, and how do you call it? Constantly informed by discussions and issues that were heavily discussed, societal issues, and that's what we do at the moment. So I think we need to be aware of the fact of these, what Ludo just said, these kind of yeah, let's call it holes in the institute or blind spots, and I think that's important too. But we should not stop, I think, collecting the oeuvres of architectural practices. And then I mean, let's say, architecture in the broader sense of the word, which also includes the architecture of these workspaces we just referred to, and includes the architecture of squatters, so to say. But we should not stop doing that, but we should always, and a next generation will definitely also do, like, well, critically reflect upon what this acquisition policy entails. And yeah, sorry, I can't actually not. Well, it's a very good question, but yeah, I think you need to be aware of, you know, what is interesting in the Institute right now is that our colleagues of the Heritage Department are doing research into, let's say, how these acquisition policies or policy actually changed in the past 100 years and why. And I think this is really interesting to kind of, you know, compare that, or to reflect upon our own, let's say, doings at the moment, the way we reflect upon it, and the way we want to kind of open up or expand or whatever, you know, as part of a larger history where we try to, or we, sorry, excuse my words, but the Institute tries, and the precursors of the Institute try to steer the direction of its collection into a particular direction. Yeah.
For this question, there's also in the audience a very interesting member, Dirk, who can tell much more about this. So maybe for the next conversation.
Oh yes, Dirk is here as well. Yeah.
And I don't know if I may allow myself a brief follow-up to this question. I was thinking that I would be also very interested in relation to the issue of audiences, not only about which kind of audiences we are talking about, but also about the practical or specific impact that this kind of curatorial practice could have on these audiences or on these communities. And I don't know, my question would be, in a way, have you had the chance to see in these years also any kind of more or less direct outcome which was originated from these projects? I mean, I don't know, just to mention the first few very banal ones that come to my mind, but I don't know, the use of the application of Steinen within the architectural discourse, or on the other side, a different awareness of the landscape in the architectural practice after the automated landscape project. I don't know. Did you manage to measure or to verify the results of your work to this extent? I see also that Dirk confirmed that he's listening. Obviously, he can intervene if he would like, but
I'm sure he agrees. Well, I think, Martin, this is your territory, literally and figuratively, the question.
Maybe you want to start, Julia, because I saw you no?
My answer was no, I don't know. I mean, maybe my colleagues at the Flanders Architecture Institute know, but I don't know the answer to your question, Filippo.
Well, yeah, maybe it's also a good question, but maybe Ludo gave an answer to it already by saying that in the past, let's say 18 months, we saw. Oh, Dirk is responding again. Oh, he's not able to talk. As an attendee, so in the past 18 months or so, especially in our own context of the Netherlands, we saw yeah, a bit more interest in this subject, and we're of course not the only one. So if we reflect upon this topic of automation and the countryside, you know, it's not only us that was, let's say, working on that. So no, but you actually asked is it possible to measure? I don't think that is possible, but could you elaborate a bit more on that? So what do you mean with measuring the outcomes, or if it's Filippo? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, yes, I was just reading also the comment we just received from Dirk, who notes that it is interesting, he writes, to hear that we are talking about audiences where the overall project is about communities of tacit and shared knowledge. Yeah, just to add it on the table, but I think we were using also audiences a bit as in the same, with the same kind of acceptation or of meaning of communities. Obviously, actually in the direction of establishing a possible dialogue with such audiences, and to making them let's say communities in a way.
But maybe to respond to the previous question, I think what you see now very much happening in the Netherlands is a debate about this kind of the boxes, right? So all these, then they talk about in these data centers and whatever, logistical boxes everywhere. And then what we see right now is that discussion is very much built on, let's say, rather aesthetic approaches of that phenomena, and really looking at architecture as a kind of, how can we solve the problem that we have to encounter, that we encountered here, right? So we see that discussion happening now, and then we really think like, okay, but this is exactly, I would say, not the discussion we should have at this moment, and really look at this phenomena from a much broader perspective, and look also at, let's say, the implications of the labor which is performed inside, or how do we also, let's say, look at the idea of the landscape beyond that kind of rather romantic idea of the kind of the pasture and the kind of the green field, because that green land or pasture isn't so natural anymore at all. It's like, it's totally industrialized as well. So I think in that sense, our kind of the fact that we started with this research from a much broader perspective helped us also then, let's say, and I hope that it also kind of then trickles down into that national debate, and I think it will, or it is already happening now, in which we also kind of broaden up that rather claustrophobic discussion sometimes.
Yeah, but to be a bit pessimistic about this, I really don't understand why, you know, the answer of let's say this particular community, if we talk about communities instead of audiences, but always needs to come up with this kind of aesthetic perspective on, you know, we need to kind of design nice facades for these boxes, and what we really tried, and of course some are picking up, but we really try to do is to focus on the mechanisms behind these developments. Why are these boxes there? Why are and really try to address that this is also something which used to be part of the architectural profession, let's say until the 16th century, maybe 17th century, if you look at the hinterland of Venice, for instance. Yeah, it's like, in that sense, I'm a bit pessimistic, but yes, and at the same time, we have still, something to do, and also maybe look out for other ways to disseminate the knowledge, or maybe also, and that's what we actually also to add to that, it's like what we try to do is to participate in all these kinds of conversations in the past year, and we were invited to give lectures, etc. So for instance, we the first years we only published articles, for instance, in English, and now we start to publish in Dutch as well, and we start to engage in these conversations. So yeah, maybe this will help, but at the same time, it's also difficult because there is no mandate, there is no position, there is no role for architects, to engage in these types of conversations, right? So in that sense, for us, easy and to reflect upon it from our, let's say, research tower. Yeah.
Thank you. I see that there is also one more question from the audience, from Margita Buchert, who writes, why did you choose the title landscape? And perhaps it is also, I can imagine, related to this issue of aesthetical, let's say, appreciation of the landscape, as we were saying, or
Yeah. No, very good question. But that was in 2016, yes, when we decided to pick to have this title. So, but I would definitely use another title if we would start the project now. So this is, spot on this question, because it's exactly what is happening right now. So if you reflect upon these developments, these environments, these spaces, from this landscapes perspective, you will always end up in this debate about aesthetics, and I think it's impossible, to reflect upon on these landscapes in let's say landscape terms, because this landscape always, let's say, requires a point from, let's say, outside that particular environment. So the landscape is something which, let's say, occurred, or this notion of the landscape, something that occurred in the 16th century, and always, let's say, requires the view of the outsider to frame this particular landscape, and that is something that is not possible anymore, because, and that's also what we really want to address and what Ludo also addressed in the presentation, like it's these boundaries between let's say city and hinterland, or city and landscape, or countryside, this boundary between inside and outside has become fully blurred. For instance, the polders that all these data centers are built right now are by companies like Microsoft and Google are called Amsterdam North, right? And for Dutch people, it's seen as something far away from that city, and so yeah, we need to come up with other terms, I would say, and but I don't know what the best term would be. But yeah, and once again, it's a good question. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And yes, I think we are running a bit out of time. And I also know that you have are hosting another event tonight. So probably you will have to go. I hope this will be really only the starting point for a much deeper and longer exchange within the network with your institutions. And yes, I thank you very much one more time, all our guests, Julia, Martin, and Ludo, and our respondents, Candy and Jono, and also all the people who is connected with us tonight. So yes, thank you again, and I wish you all a very nice evening. Goodbye.